I'm Scott Al Miller. This is my life living in Nicaragua. Today we're going to be talking about a little bit of what we expect to be happening from the United States as far as it's going to impact travel to and from Nicaragua. Now, this is anticipatory. We do not actually know that this is going to happen, but this is based on statements that have been made and historical precedent. So it's an important, even if we don't know what's going to happen, it's something that it's important for anyone who is living here or thinking about living here to consider, because it could create some logistical headaches for people attempting to live in the area. That doesn't mean that you should make decisions based upon this, but it should be part of your thought process just so you're prepared for things. What are we talking about? Well, we're going to get to that right after the bump. By now, many of you have probably forgotten, but about whatever it is, 9 years ago, there was a large set of travel bans enacted for the United States when Trump took office in 2016. This, at the time, included a lot of the Middle East and a few other little areas, and it didn't impact too many Americans themselves in many cases, and it only lasted for, I believe, about a year, maybe even less. It was not a huge thing. It was in the news quite a bit, but it wasn't super impactful for the majority of us. And that's probably true with pretty much any travel ban. The average American isn't traveling overseas, so it doesn't really hit that hard for most people. But for those of my audience, which is almost all of you, who are either looking at moving to Nicaragua, looking at visiting Nicaragua, looking at traveling through Nicaragua, live in Nicaragua, and so forth, any potential ban that could include Nicaragua would be of relative importance, because even if you're not an American, you are generally impacted by travel that comes from Nicaragua and goes through the United States, because the majority of transit from Nicaragua goes through the U.S. Everyone in the region uses the U.S. heavily. Flights from Spirit, American, United, Avianca all originate and terminate in the U.S. when coming through Nicaragua, and others from Copa and Aeromexico connect to the United States and may not be directly impacted by a travel ban, but could. So what would a travel ban include? Well, we don't really know, right? This is one, we know that a travel ban has happened in the past, and we know that a travel ban is being discussed in official channels, like by the president himself, as a consideration. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen, of course, but what we do know is that travel bans are being considered and that they have been enacted historically. We know that they were eventually overturned historically, which means that if they're talking about it now, there are some different plans as to how they will be approached. So even if you're like, well, they weren't effective in the past, they didn't really hold, that is unlikely to be true. Now, there's more information about how to do it. They will take a different approach. They will be more measured and intentional rather than a little bit haphazard. So expect, if a travel ban goes into effect, that it will at least take effect for quite some period of time, and very easily indefinitely. Now, would a travel ban result in airlines and other mechanisms working to work around that ban? Of course, travel will continue. People will still try to come in and out of countries, just as they did during the travel ban with the United States in 2016, and it simply means that alternative destinations have to be used as immediate connections from the United States. So there are ways that people will work around it. There's ways that you'll still be able to travel, and the airlines, such as Aeromexico, who goes directly to Mexico, will probably pick up some of the slack. Avianca, who goes to El Salvador, will probably pick up some of the slack by moving people from Nicaragua into other regions, allowing them to do a re-entry through their international flight security checks and therefore be past the ban and able to travel onto the United States. A travel ban does not mean that people in Nicaragua cannot get to the United States. It means that transit from Nicaragua can't go directly to the United States if Nicaragua was in a travel ban from a country within the travel ban zone. So there's a lot of things we don't know. Is a travel ban generally going to happen? It seems like more than 50%. Seems like a decent likelihood, but it's certainly not guaranteed. And would Nicaragua be included in that travel ban? Well, it seems likely, but again, not guaranteed. Historically, they have not done travel bans to Latin America, so we may be exempt. Once again, we are super close to the United States. Doing a ban from here would be a little bit dramatic. And of course, doing a travel ban to Nicaragua at a time when they're trying to do deportations to Nicaragua would not make sense, because that would technically mean they're banning their own deportation flights, not something that they probably want to do. So we don't expect it to happen immediately, but we do have a certain anticipatory position that we are within the list of countries being considered for it. And what we know is that the political ideology of countries' governments is being listed as reasons that they will consider countries for travel bans. Countries that are socialist, countries that provide heavy resources to their public, free healthcare, things like that. Just providing free healthcare is enough to put you on consideration for the list. Now, of course, we don't have any anticipation that, like, Canada is going to be on the list. Of course, their free healthcare is also garbage, so that often exempts them from feeling like a socialist country, and many other things that they do. They're super authoritarian, so they generally fall into a different type of category. But countries that are very free and take care of their citizens and focus very much on citizen care, that concept, right, and quite literally just providing free healthcare does get you listed as socialist within the United States in their framework. So because Nicaragua is a very citizen-focused country, the United States certainly is mentioning it as a country that they are considering for a ban. And the governments of the United States and Nicaragua have always been antagonistic, of course, since the United States invaded in the 1850s and has always had a military presence and or threat of presence within Nicaragua for 170 years. There is no way that they have completely friendly relations at any given time. It is always antagonistic. So we are always potentially on the list that the United States is going to attempt to cause a little bit more pain when they can, as long as it doesn't cause too much pain back at home. So we have very good reasons, because they were mentioned by proxy in the statement from the government as to who they were considering for a travel ban, because there's very few countries, when you say socialist governments, because they also listed Marxist governments, which would include places like Cuba or China. So they are obviously being listed for consideration. Nicaragua does not fall into that category, but it does fall into the socialist category, and they're very proud of being a citizen-focused country, which, again, none of these things affect tourists. None of these things affect expats, right? How the government functions has nothing to do with us. But when the U.S. is doing travel bans based on their opinion of how other governments should treat their citizens and how they should organize their economies, the United States is using that as a listing for travel bans. So we have to be aware of what kind of countries the United States is considering. So by mentioning that, Nicaragua is probably easy to state as the poster child for socialism, at least in North America. And so it's unlikely that the United States is referring to anyone else as specifically as Nicaragua in this proposed list for a potential ban. It's a lot of ifs and maybes and couched in verbiage, but we need to be aware that what is being said by the U.S. government suggests that they are considering punitive action against Nicaragua within a framework of punitive action against many countries around the world who do not toe the American line, so to speak. And really, the United States generally considers this. They will list anyone that way that is not a government that they have put in place. So countries generally that the U.S. has promoted, for example, Marxism around the world, when it is a government that the United States has placed there and uses Marxist principles within a framework of being subservient to the United States. The U.S. is actually a huge promoter of Marxism in many markets and always has been. And the first Marxist government to be put into Nicaragua in the 1800s was an American dictator at the time, William Walker, who had the government seize all means of production so that they could control every aspect of the economy. And it was only when they started seizing American assets in great number that the U.S. stepped in and said, okay, that doesn't work for us anymore, but they were happy to put in a dictator of their own, an American who came in and made it an American colony, part of Tennessee, and put in that type of government. So the U.S. has always been traditionally promoting Marxism long before it was popular within the region. It only became known in the region due to its promotion from U.S. colonization efforts. So the U.S. is the ultimate in Marxicizing countries around the world. Literally, I believe no country has had more effort put into actually promoting it outside their own borders. But when it's promoted by the U.S., when it's a government that they've put in, then they overlook the form of government and say that it's fine. And when they don't put it in and it doesn't simply answer to the U.S. government behind the scenes, then they call it they list it as Marxist. So it's a very self-serving process, but that's something that people need to understand, that that is how it works. And if you're going to be traveling to this region, how does that potentially impact you, right? So what the impact would be is that, one, tourism in Nicaragua has the potential to drop off significantly. While the United States only represents less than 50% of the total tourism to Nicaragua, it is certainly a major contributor to tourism, and it is certainly an even more major contributor to the path of tourism. So the majority of people who are coming from Europe, for example, which is a very large segment of the tourist population here in, or tourist volume here in Nicaragua, will pass through airports in the United States. If the travel ban comes into effect, that travel path will be gone. They will have to travel through Mexico. They will have to travel through Costa Rica, have to travel through Panama, someone who's connecting to Nicaragua without then going through the United States. Canada is not an option. Canada would have to connect to one of those countries, right? Because Canada does not have direct connections to Nicaragua. And if the United States put in a ban, even though then Canadians would be very desirous of a direct path to Nicaragua, it is unlikely for the Canadian government to put in a path to basically be a blockade runner against the United States. As much as Canadians like to think that they are an independent country, they do not operate independent of American politics. And unless, and this is a great test of that, right? If the U.S. puts in a ban, will Canada work around it? I guarantee they will never consider it in any way whatsoever. If Canada was truly an independent country operating without having the U.S. approve most of what they do, they would just obviously provide their citizens with paths to come in immediately, because it's such an important path there. But they can't operate that independently. They just don't have that clout in the region. They have to fly over the United States. They would have to get clear. They don't have the freedom to do that. And this will be a great test for those who think that it is. I guarantee, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but I guarantee Canada will be stuck towing the line against their will, because it is certainly not useful for them. It'd be very detrimental to Canadians as well, and would present a really big opportunity for Canada to become a more major traffic hub in the region, to allow Europeans to come into Central America through Canada. But again, just not an expectation that we have. That is why Canadian flights typically only go to Mexico and Costa Rica. So getting around the travel ban, while doable if you're here in Nicaragua and you need to get to the United States, you're going to be doing a lot of the things that we already do, right? Traveling overland to other airports or flying to other airports. So going to Costa Rica, going to Panama, Mexico, El Salvador, those countries will be still accessible. Cuba, which we do have access to, would be expected to be in the ban as well. If Nicaragua goes into it, Cuba will go into it, and almost certainly, and Cuba for sure, and Venezuela are more likely to go into the ban than Nicaragua, but pretty much as a group, it would be all or nothing. We expect, it just seems like the logical thing. So you would still be able to get to the United States, but cost would go way up. The number of flights would go way down. Traffic would be much heavier. The majority of people coming and going, if you're a tourist, it would simply convince a large majority of tourists to just not bother during the time that there's a ban. It's just too much effort, right? Not likely to do it. So that's an effective mechanism that the government, the U.S. government may want to use, simply because it doesn't actually forbid you to go. It just means that you can't do it in the cheap, convenient way that you can today. It would disrupt those flight paths and so forth. It would encourage Nicaraguans to travel throughout the region in places that don't travel through the U.S., but for the most part, it would simply discourage travel, make it very difficult for Nicaraguans to get to Europe as well. Hopefully some new flight paths would come in, and Nicaragua is building that new airport. Of course, it would accelerate that, because that airport would, we keep saying, should have direct access to Europe and South America, which would allow Nicaraguans to do business with and travel and have tourism in more parts of the world, rather than depending so much on the United States. So I think Nicaragua is well poised to accommodate needing to diversify its travel options in the near future. But it would be enormously impactful, right? It would make it very difficult for those of us who live here as Americans to leave and go anywhere else. It would make it very difficult for Americans who are not here to come and visit. You'd need to transit through another country and probably do a full transit, so you don't have a flight that goes all the way through. Like, you would fly to Mexico City, get off, spend a night in Mexico City, get back on a plane and come. That may not be the case and may not require that much of a break in the travel plans to be able to do, but it is potential that such a thing would happen. The biggest encouragement for there not to be a travel ban is because it is so easy to work around that it would be seen as a pretty silly mechanism. You're not actually preventing anything, you're just making it a little bit inconvenient, but it's also a very powerful mechanism, because inconvenience makes a big difference. So I wouldn't take this as a serious concern. If Nicaragua is the right place for you, if it's a place you want to come visit, then it's going to be fine. You're going to be able to, a lot of people have those breaks in their travel plans anyway, depending on where you're coming from, but it is worth being aware. And those of us that are here or going to be here, sometimes we have these regular plans to go back and forth with the United States. If that's something you're looking at doing, having regular business where you live in one and travel back and forth constantly, I have a friend who does that every few weeks, that could get a lot more complicated and expensive in the near future and for the indefinite future. So it's things that you may need to have some mental planning for. Don't be shocked and surprised if it does come to fruition. We expect it to happen. So that's, you know, on one side, we expect this to happen. We're not too worried about it. On the other hand, it is an inconvenience. We expect it to be a disruption. If you have a tourism business or you're thinking you're going to invest in Nicaragua, just be aware that you're looking at potentially a major downturn in tourism coming relatively quickly. That could go on for quite some time. And there's just, the world is shaking up, and so the more things that we can be aware of and plan for, the better position we're going to be in to not be caught unaware and be able to best accommodate whatever those changes are going to be. For us, you know, if we lose all access to the United States directly from the airports, we will simply go to Liberia and take flights from there. Relatively easy. We do that sometimes anyway out of convenience, or we need to go to El Salvador, which is, again, not very far away. It's very similar distance in reality to Liberia. It just has more borders that are more hectic to go through in between, and so Costa Rica tends to be more organized and just easier to deal with in many things. But going across Honduras to El Salvador is also completely approachable, and flights from El Salvador to the United States are unexpected to have any disruption. There's no reason for that. They are not on any mentioned list that the United States has proposed. They are not in any description that the U.S. proposed, so we should have no problems from there or from Mexico. Now, Mexico is a little bit farther away, so that would be inconvenient. But El Salvador, relatively convenient and easy. And of course, we do have flights from Nicaragua to both El Salvador and Costa Rica if you don't want to take a bus, you don't want to drive yourself, and so forth. But clearly, just in mentioning things, you can hear how this is less convenient than just driving to Managua if you want to get back to the United States. So something to plan for. Be aware when you're thinking of what your life could be like when living in Nicaragua. If you're thinking that going back to the United States all the time is going to be so easy and so quick, generally that is true, but there could be this disruption to it, and it may be very brief. It may not even happen, but just make sure that it is something you are planning for. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. We also have a link below to join. You can ask your questions, scroll down, say hello, introduce yourself. We also have all kinds of information, including our WhatsApp group that is the Expats of Nicaragua group in WhatsApp. The links are in the description. It's a great place to go and just talk to people like me and other expats and get real-time feedback, questions, whatever. Concerns, how do you fly into Nicaragua when there's a ban, like all that kind of stuff. That's where people have the most up-to-date information for sure. We also have instructions in the video, in the show notes on how to send a video of yourself into the show so you can be on the show, which is fantastic. A bunch of people have done that recently, and it's so awesome putting you guys on the show and having you connect and do all that and become a part of the show with the rest of us. So thank you as all for joining me. Watch another video and tell someone about the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow.